Welcome to this overview of the Affinity Tenant and Property Management Solution for Housing Associations. As you can see, Affinity is a web-based application, means it can be accessed via a web browser from any location where you have internet access. This is the login screen. You can create as many user accounts as you wish for your Affinity account. There's no additional charge for this. And there's 3 levels of login that can be assigned to individual users. The top level being a manager. The manager has access to all of the Affinity application features. Next level down is an admin user. This is similar to manager access level, but the admin user does not have access to the user account features within the admin area, nor to the finance and bank facilities. The lowest level is a system user. The system user is pretty much read-only view of the application, and it's prevented from accessing the bank feature in its entirety and any of the maintenance functions. So I'm going to go ahead here and log in to this demo account. After logging in, the first screen that we're presented with is called the Affinity Dashboard, and it consists of 4 dashlets, and it's really information that needs your immediate attention, such as rents that are overdue, work orders or maintenance activities that are past their estimated completion date, vacant properties, and here we've got a useful summary of all overdue alerts within the system. Now, we actually have a selection of about a dozen of these dashlets. If you find that one of these isn't of use to your association, we can swap it out and put another in its place. Other examples are property inspection alerts, safety check alerts, and BRs that are about to expire, etc. The way the data is organized within Affinity is that we've got housing groups. Housing groups are collections of properties, and associated with properties we've got tenants and tenancies. So to add a new housing group into the system, we just click on Housing Groups and then click on Add Housing Group. The form here is fairly typical of what we'll see when we're adding new information into the application. It consists of a number of fields. Some of these may be mandatory and these are denoted by a red asterisk. The others are optional, so you don't have to supply this information if you don't wish. The 2 mandatory fields are the type. This is the funding type associated with this housing group. This can be overridden on a per property basis, so it's just a default funding type for this housing group. The second thing is a name, and it's just some sort of label that we denote or recognize this particular housing group, say for instance a housing development name. The optional fields include the housing officer associated with this housing group. Again, this can be overridden on a per property basis, and other fields such as the GPRN, MPRN numbers if this housing group has got communal gas or electricity supplies. So when we've finished adding the information in, we just click on Add Housing Group and that'll add it into the system. I'm now going to look at an existing housing group, and I can do that by clicking on the List Housing Groups option in the main menu bar. This presents a list of housing groups that we've previously entered into the application. I can view an individual housing group either by clicking on the pencil icon on the right hand side or by the name of the housing group. You'll see that this is fairly similar to the add screen, except now we've got a series of tabs across the top. The Details tab is the information that we've already discussed. Next is the Properties tab. This is a list of the properties that make up this housing group. The Charges tab are charges applied by any management company associated with this housing group. Site inspections, as the name suggests, these are inspections that are conducted at the housing group level, either of communal areas or of the housing group grounds. To add details of a site inspection that's recently been completed, you can just click on this Add Inspection button. You'll see that we specify the date the inspection took place on, who conducted the site inspection, specify what condition the site or housing group was in. We can add any notes that we wish. And then if we've completed our own inspection report on a third-party application such as Microsoft Word, we can upload that and store it against the housing group inspection. When we've completed that, we just click on Add Inspection and that'll add it into the system. You'll see after doing this, we enter like an edit mode where we have the ability to upload any additional documentation associated with the inspection, and we can even upload photographs that we have taken during the site inspection. When we have finished uploading those, just click on View Inspection Photos to return us to the previous screen. When we have added all the information that's required, just click on this Cancel button to return to the main view of the housing group. When that's completed, the next thing to do is schedule when the next inspection is due for this housing group. And we can do that by clicking on this calendar utility at the top of the screen and setting the required date. Now, Affinity provides us with a suite of tools to remind us about upcoming site inspections. These include our dashboard, where we can include site inspections as one of our dashlets. We also have a suite of what we call alert reports, and you'll see that one of these is site inspection alert, so we can select that, click on next, and you'll see here is our housing group, and it's telling us that we have 365 days before the next inspection is due for this particular housing group. The last thing is that we can send email reminders to the housing officer associated with this housing group, and it can be done via Admin Control Panel. You'll see one of the tabs here is Alert Settings, and you'll see we can set alert intervals for various items, safety checks, property inspections, and also our site inspections. So if I set that value to 20 days, that means that 20 days before this site inspection is due, the housing officer associated with this housing group will receive an email notification reminding them to schedule the upcoming site inspection. We'll now go back to our housing group view. And the next tab in the sequence is block services. These are things like fire extinguisher checks, lift maintenance, etc. that have to be performed on a regular basis. Now you'll see that there are a number of predefined block services check types, but you're free to go and add your own types via admin settings in the main menu. To record details of a block services check that's been performed, click on this button over here. Select the services check type from the drop-down list, the date in which the inspection took place. We can optionally set an expiry date associated with this, upload a copy of the electronic certificate if one is available, enter a certificate number, and any notes associated with this. When we've finished, we just click on Add Block Services Check Type, and it adds it into the system. If we've made any errors, we can subsequently edit this service check type or delete it from the system. Again, we can review service checks that are about to expire via alert reports or via the Affinity dashboard. The next tab along is insurance policies, where we can store details of policies that have been taken out at a housing group level. This is followed by tenant engagement. It's now a requirement from the regulator that housing associations can demonstrate that they've been engaging with their client base or tenant base. And we can store details of committee contact details, any associated documents, and even details of events that have been organised for our tenants. Here, for instance, we have recorded details of a summer barbecue. We can store details of photos that have been taken during that event, any notes associated with that. The last tab along is a Documents tab, and here we can upload miscellaneous documents, Word documents, PDFs associated with this housing group. After adding one or more housing groups, we're now in a position to add properties into Affinity, and we can do that by selecting Properties, Add Property from the main menu bar. You'll see some of the mandatory fields here that a property must belong to a housing group, so we can select that from the drop-down list. Once we have done that, you'll see that default values are populated for the funding scheme type and the housing officer, but as I mentioned earlier, these can be overridden at this property level. We then obviously have to supply an address for the property. We've got a handy address lookup facility, so if I enter, say, an error code or a partial address, the system will look up that address for me. I can select that and then it populates the full address for me. You'll see most of the fields here are optional, but one that is mandatory and may look a bit unusual is the dwelling type. The reason for this is that Affinity has the ability to export the information that you need for your RTB or Residential Tenancy Board registrations. And one of the mandatory fields required in those registrations is the dwelling type. So we have to select that from the drop down list. If we select a type of house, then we also have to select a property type. Once you've finished adding all the required information, just click on Add Property at the bottom of the screen, and that'll record the property within the application. I'm now going to look at an existing property within Affinity, and I could do this by selecting Properties, List Properties from the main menu bar. But you'll see that this could potentially return hundreds of properties, and it would be slightly unwieldy to try and identify it by paginating through various screens. So if I'm searching for anything within the application, I tend to use this search facility up at the top of the screen, be it a property, a housing group, a tenant, a work order, etc. I just type in a partial bit of the text, hit return, and it'll return all entities that match the text that I've supplied. So the property that I'm looking for is 3 Bellevue Terrace. I just click on that and it brings me to the property view. As for the housing groups, you'll see that we're now presented with a series of tabs. But first I want to look at some additional details that are within the summary tab. These are located in the bottom right area of the screen. First thing I want to highlight is Care Alert. We have Care Alerts on the property view, housing group view, tenant view and supplier view. And it's just if you want to highlight a certain piece of information to all users when they view this particular entity. For instance, if you don't want people attending this property on their own, we can enter that information into the Care Alert, click on the Update button, and you'll see that we've got the information presented at the top of the screen and highlighted to any user that views this property. Secondly, we've got a voids area. Now, Affinity will infer voids due to gaps in tenancies. These would be general voids, i.e. one tenancy ends and it could be a couple of weeks or a couple of months before a new tenant moves into the property. So that's a general void. But there will be certain situations where it's basically outside the control of the housing association that there is a void. And we define these as non-standard voids. There's 3 types. There's nomination, where you're waiting on a county council or a benefit authority to nominate someone to take up a residency in this particular property. There's structural, where there's major repair work required in the property before it's fit for someone to move in. And technical, this would be the gap between tenancies where you have to perhaps paint the property, do some minor repairs. The final thing that we can do is that we can add some notes to the property, as many notes as we wish. And just add those into the system. You'll see that these are all date and time stamped along with the name of the user that has added the note into the system. We'll now look at some of the other tabs associated with the property view. First of these is the Tenancies tab. Tenancies obviously link properties to the tenants, but we define the tenancy information on the tenant view. So this is basically just a read-only view of all tenancies, both current and previous, associated with this property. Next tab along is a Photos tab. We can upload numerous photographs associated with the property, both inside and out. Next tab is the Inspections tab. Now this is similar to the site inspections that we looked at the housing group level. To add details of an inspection that's taken place, we just click on the Add Inspection button. You'll see that we have a number of inspection types that can be selected from, so we'll just leave this at Housing General. The date on which the inspection took place on, who performed the housing inspection. Again, we can select the condition of the property. Again, if we have completed an inspection report in, say, a Word document, we can upload it and store it against this inspection record. And finally, we have the ability to record any miscellaneous notes associated with the property inspection. After we click on the Add Inspection button, we go into an edit mode. There's a couple of additional things that we can do here. You'll see that we've got a house inspection sheet which we can complete. This basically lists a generic set of rooms within the property, and we can add notes against each of those rooms and whether a callback is required. It's just like a basic word processor. Just enter the information. You'll see your formatting options across the top here. When you've completed that, you can just click on Add to bring you back to the inspection report. We can also upload any photographs that we've taken during the property inspection. I will attempt to do that. That's been uploaded. I can view those inspection records. When I finish, just click on the Cancel button. And as for the site inspections, we want to schedule when the next inspection is due for this particular property, perhaps 6 months from now, and click on Schedule. Again, we've got an alert report associated with this. So what I'll do is I'm duplicating the screen here. What I'm doing is looking at inspection alerts at the property level. So selected inspection alerts for properties, and here you have 3 Bellevue Terrace down at the bottom, and it's telling me there's 183 days before the next inspection is due for this property. The next tab along is the Safety Checks tab. This is similar to the Block Services Checks tab available on housing groups. As before, we predefine a number of safety check types, such as electrical tests, gas safety check types, etc. But you're free to go and modify these, add your own safety check types within admin settings. So to add a new safety check, we just click on the Add Safety Check button. We select the safety check type from the drop-down list, say gas safety check, date the inspection took place. The expiry date will be automatically populated for us, but we do have the option of changing that. We can enter a certificate number. If available, we can upload an electronic copy of the safety cert and add any notes if applicable. When complete, we just click on Add Safety Check. Because they've got an expiry date associated with them, this will create an entry in a Safety Check Alerts report. So if I duplicate this tab, we'll have a look at this report as well. So Reports, Alerts, Safety Check Alerts, click on Next, and what we'll see is here we have for 3 Bellevue Terrace, we've got a gas safety check, and it's telling us there's 364 days before that's due for renewal. Moving on, we've got energy certs, so you can record details of your BERs, including expiry dates, and again we've got an alert report to tell you when the BER is about to expire. Insurance policies, if you have any insurance policies at a property level, you can record details of these, and yet again we've got an alert report to tell you when that insurance policy is about to expire. And finally, we've got a Documents tab where you can add miscellaneous documents, again such as PDF, Word documents, etc., associated with this property. Okay, so we've defined our housing groups and properties. We now need some tenants to place in our properties. So to add a new tenant into the system, select Tenants, Add Tenant from the main menu bar. You'll see that most of the information is optional here. We really just have to supply a name and allocate them an account number. An account number is your internal reference for this particular tenant and will be used throughout Affinity to identify that particular tenant. You can either enter your own alphanumeric account number if you have one, or get Affinity to allocate one on your behalf. It'll just increment the number every time you allocate an account number to a new tenant. You'll see other optional information in that we've got a mobile description. The reason we've got a description here is that there's SMS capability within the application. So you can send out text messages to both tenants and suppliers. It can either be on an individual basis or on a block basis if you need to broadcast something to a group of tenants. Over on the right hand side, we've got some association details. This is quite important. When you first start to use Affinity, we don't expect you to put all your historical data into the application, such as all rents that have ever been applied, all rents that have ever been paid by the tenant. So what you can do is you can say, right, We're going to start managing this tenant within Affinity on a specific date. It can be today, it can be the start of the month, or it can be start of the year, whatever date you wish. On that date, this existing tenant would have an opening rent balance. If say there were €300 in arrears, we would just put in a figure of minus 300 in the opening tenant balance. So this is like a reference balance going forward. There'll be no rent supplied prior to this opening balance date, even if you define that the tenancy started X number of months ago, last year, for instance. Just some of the other information that you can store within the tenant view, such as employment details, a secondary or forwarding address if applicable. Again, as before, when you finish adding the details, just click on Add Tenant and that'll add it into the system for you. We're now going to look at an existing tenant, and we can do that via Tenants, List Tenants. But as before, I'm going to use the quick search facility up at the top of the screen. So I type part of the tenant's name, hit return, and when I identify the tenant that I'm looking for, just click on their name. As before, we've got a series of tabs across the top here. First one being the Details tab. I've already explained some of this information, but I just want to point out a few other panes that are available within this view. So we've got the tenancy details if this is a current tenant. Over in the top right, we've got the association details that include any current balance associated with the tenant. You have the facility to upload a photograph of the tenant. We can add multiple email addresses, employment details, and down at the bottom right, as we've seen before, there's the ability to add multiple notes associated with the tenant. Again, these are all date and time stamped along with the name of the person that entered them. We're now going to look at one of the most powerful features within Affinity, and that's the ability to perform a rent assessment on your tenant. So we can do that by clicking on the Rent Assessments tab and then the Add Assessment button. First thing that we should do is to define the date in which the assessment took place, and then the effective date is the date that you want the new rent value to kick in from, so perhaps the 1st of June. After we have done that, we can select the relevant rent policy. You'll see that we have preloaded the Affinity account with the majority of City and County Council rent policies. So I shall select Cork City here. The next step is the income sources. So we have to define what the income sources are for the various earning members of the household, starting with the principal earner. So the source is where they receive this income from, perhaps employment. I can optionally put in a description in relation to that, and then the actual weekly value of the income. I do have the option of adding multiple income sources for this principal earner. But when I finish doing that, I can add details relating to income sources for one or more subsidiary earners as well. So if, for instance, this subsidiary earner is also in employment, I can add their details in also. When I have all the income sources defined within the system, we can supply any other additional information required by this particular rent policy. So it may ask for number of dependents within the family. Are there any dependent adults? And then when we have that done, we can click on this calc link, and hey presto, it comes up with the new rental value for this tenancy. You'll see down at the bottom we have the option of adding a rent record if there is an existing tenancy for this tenant. Basically, it just means for an existing tenant that this new rent value will kick in from the effective date that we have defined here. So I just click on Add Rent Assessment. Rent assessments obviously aren't applicable to all types of housing, so it is an optional exercise. We'll now move on to defining tenancy details via the Tenancies tab. We start off by clicking on New Tenancy. The system is warning us that active tenancy already exists for this particular tenant. We'll ignore this for this overview. First thing that we must do is to define the property in which this tenant is going to reside. Now this drop-down list can get a bit unwieldy, so in cases like that you'll see that we'll have a text box to the right of the drop-down, and if we start to type the first part of the address, this drop-down narrows to match the text that we have supplied. So I'm looking for 3 Bellevue Terrace, so just select that from the drop-down list. Next, we define the tenancy details. when the tenancy is actually going to commence. If you're new to using Affinity, this should be the actual tenancy start date, even if it predates the opening balance date associated with the tenant. No rents will be applied until on or after the opening balance date. The rental period is how often the tenant is expected to pay rent. Is it every week or every month? We can optionally put in if a security deposit is required from the tenant. Doesn't mean it's been paid yet, it just means it's due. These last few fields are to do with RTB registrations. They are optional, but there is the facility to export tenancies that have been created over a specified date range, and all the information required will be supplied for you. Finally, down at the bottom, we've got recurring charge information. So obviously the primary one may be the rent, how much rent is due from the tenant per rental period, in this case per week. We can also define other recurring charge types such as management fees, service charges, and you can also in the admin area of Affinity define your own recurring charge types. So say for instance there's a care charge if your primary tenants are the elderly, you can define that within the system and then that will appear when you're defining your tenancy information. Also want to point out that some tenants may be in receipt of some forms of benefits, RAS payments, etc. So it is possible to define what is due from the tenant and what is due from the benefit authority. So again, you'll see that it's very powerful in what you can do when you're defining the tenancy. By doing this, Affinity will be able to track all different aspects of the tenant balance, what the rent balance is, what a service charge balance is, what a care charge balance is, and what the split is for each of these recurring balances, split between both what is owed by the tenant and what is owed from the benefit authority. With the tenancy details defined, Affinity will look after the automatic application of your recurring charges, for example your rents and your service charges on the weekly or the monthly basis. That was how we add a new tenancy, but I want to look at an existing tenancy. Just a couple of additional things to point out here. One is that we can add additional tenant information associated with this tenancy. And the second thing is, obviously, the rental value of a tenancy can vary over time. We don't create new tenancies each time that happens. Rather, we add a new charge schedule to the tenancy, either by the completion of a rent assessment, which we looked at earlier, or we can do this manually by updating the tenancy and defining the new rental, service charge values, etc., and the date in which these are going to kick in on. Once we've added those details in, just click on the Add Charge Schedule button and it'll add it to the list of previously applicable charge schedules. I'll cancel out of that. Moving on to fees. We defined our recurring charges via the Tenancies tab, but there may also be occasions where you charge one-off fees or expenses to the tenant. Examples of these could be, say, a recharge. If the tenant has caused some property damage, the housing association pays for this up front but wants to claw it back from the tenant. So you can define additional one-off charges to the tenant in addition to the recurring charges. The next tab along is the Correspondence tab. There are two features associated with this. One is the ability to send miscellaneous text messages to the tenant. We can just type in whatever information we wish and send that off in the form of a text message. The second is the ability to record details of both incoming and outgoing telephone conversations with this particular tenant. Following this, we've got the Letters tab. This allows us to draft letters from either preformed letter templates or even a blank letter. So, for instance, if we want to send a rent arrears letter to the tenant, we can specify the template itself, give it a subject, the date, associate it with the letter, click on Next, and what you'll see here is a basic word processor. You'll see that there's mail merge capabilities provided within the system, in that it's automatically inserted the tenant's name, the account number, rent arrear balance, current date, etc. but you're still free to go and modify this as you see fit, format it using the toolbar up at the top here, and when you've finished, you can click on Add and it'll record it within the system. So here's the letter that we've just added. So we can view that. It'll generate it in PDF format. We can format this with the logo of your housing association, so you can print this out and post it to the tenant. As an alternative, you can send this in email format to the tenant. The letter templates are added by the Affinity support team, so if you require additional templates added to your own account, just send them to the support team and we'll get them added for you. Alongside that is a Documents tab. Again, as with housing groups and properties, you can just add miscellaneous documents against this particular tenant instance. The Complaints tab, this is if the tenant raises a complaint with you. So we can record details of that, specify the associated property, who submitted it, that would be the person who took the initial details within your organization, who's going to take ownership of that. They will receive an email notification that a new complaint has been assigned to them. We categorize it, so I'll just say that this is a general complaint and it was received via an inbound call from the tenant. We can give it a priority. This is basically the level within your organization that the complaint has reached. So it can start off at staff level, going right up to director level. We have a submission date. You can specify an estimated completion date. And as with other alerts, we've got a report that will highlight complaints that are past their estimated completion date but haven't been resolved yet. You can upload a written submission if that has been supplied and then put in details of the complaint. When completed, we just submit that and you'll see that it's now in a raised state. We then have to progress it through a couple of additional states. One, marking it as in progress, that it's now starting to be dealt with. During this time period, we can add additional documentation, as many documents as we wish, and when it's been resolved, we just mark it as complete. The last tab is the Customer Care tab, and it's similar in many ways to the Complaints tab, but these are just issues rather than complaints raised by the tenant to the housing association. It's a simpler process in that we simply raise the request, and then when it's been dealt with, we can mark it as complete. Before we leave the tenants area, I want to look at a few features that aren't specific to individual tenants. The first of these is circulars. Circulars are letters that go to multiple recipients. That could be all tenants in a particular housing group or all tenants within our housing association. So after selecting circulars as the submenu item, we click on Add Tenant Circular to add a new circular to the system. So first of all, I have to select the housing group. I can select all if it's to go to all tenants within the housing association, but in this case, I will select an individual housing group. Once I've done that, you'll see we get a list of current tenants in that housing group, and we have the option of deselecting some of these if required, simply by unchecking the tick box. I then have to give the circular a subject line and then select one of our pre-existing templates from the drop-down list. Again, as for letters, additional templates can be added to your Affinity account. So I'm going to select one in relation to house inspections and then click on Next. Now, the resulting template will look a bit odd in that it's got the Affinity tags still in place. These are replaced when the letters are actually created, and obviously they're replaced with, in this instance, each individual tenant's account number and the tenant's name and any additional tenants that are associated with that tenancy. As before, you're still able to change the text associated with the template on an individual basis. When that's completed, simply click on Add, and that will create a letter for each of the selected tenants. So you can see that it's got the account number, the tenant's name, and we can scroll down onto the next tenant and the next tenant, and you can print those off and mail them to the tenant. Another feature in the tenants area is broadcast SMSs. This allows you to send a text message to all tenants in a particular housing group or all tenants within your housing association. They're useful if you want, say, to send a message to all tenants to tell them about Christmas opening hours, or say for a particular housing group to tell them that perhaps there'll be an interruption to the water supply this afternoon. Last thing I'm going to look at this stage is rent reviews. I pointed out earlier that one of the key features of Affinity was the ability to perform rent assessments on individual tenants using the various rent policies that are published by the county and city councils. Part of many housing associations do rent reviews on, say, an annual basis, where they gather information such as income sources or benefit sources for all tenants who are subject to rent reviews. Now, this can be a very time-consuming and labour-intensive process, so we've got a feature within Affinity to assist you with that. So when it comes to that particular time of the year, you can go to the rent reviews area, click on New Rent Review, and what it's done, it has created a new rent review process within your Affinity account. It consists of only those housing groups that have at least one non-CAS property, because they're not subject to rent reviews, and it also excludes tenants that have moved in recently, because again they'll not be subject to individual rent reviews. So we can select one of these housing groups by clicking on the pencil icon, and you'll see I have the option to generate a first letter. When I do that, you'll see that it is a list of all relevant tenants within that housing association has been published here. Let's have a look at the letter that has been created. This is a default template. If required, we can change this template on your individual Affinity account for you. So you can see that it's asking for the relevant details from the individual tenant. Again, this can be posted out and sent to the tenant. Then it's a case of whenever the tenant responds, supplying the income details, we can select that tenant and specify the date on which they responded to that. So I can click that. So the response date has been set. And you'll see here against that tenant that it has set the response date. I can do that for multiple tenants. So say perhaps it comes a week or two later, we're still waiting on some responses from tenants. We can click on Generate Second Letter. Again, this template can be modified as per your needs. You'll see that it's just a follow-up letter and it's addressed to all tenants who have yet to supply the information. Similarly, we can generate a third letter a couple of weeks later as a final demand from the tenants to supply the required information, and you'll see that this particular one is informing the tenants that they're going to move on to a default rent unless they supply the required information. Now this is for an individual housing group. If I go back to the review overview, you'll see that we can do the same process for every housing group within our housing association. We can also generate an export in CSV or Excel format, which will show us how the rent review is progressing across our whole housing association. So it'll give us a list of all tenants to whom letters have been issued, when the first letter, second letter, third letter was issued, and on what date the tenant has responded. And then you'll be able to filter that to see which tenants have not responded for follow-up activities. So I'll close this down, and now I want to move on to the bank area of Affinity. In the tenant area, when we were looking at the individual tenant, we created a tenancy, and I explained that the tenancy will apply rents on a weekly or monthly basis for you. So I now want to look at the recording of rent receipts coming in, and this is done via the bank area of Affinity. So I can select bank and then tenant transactions from the main menu. You'll see that it's asking me to select tenant account number. Again, we could have hundreds of these. So if I type it in the text area to the right and hit return, you'll see that it presents details of our tenant, Linda Bellingham. There are three tabs down at the bottom: receipts, payments, credits, debits. The main tab that you will be using is the receipts tab, and that's to record incoming payments from the tenant. So say for instance the tenant had paid €100 in rent. We simply record €100 in this receipt total box. Over on the right hand side here we've got a drop down list. The tenant payment means it has been received from the tenant. We can specify which bank account the money has been paid into, the date we received that money. We optionally put a reference and a description, and you'll see over on the right hand side that Affinity has automatically allocated the full €100 to rent based on the tenancy details that we had previously supplied. If there was a breakdown of say €80 rent, €20 service charge, Affinity would automatically do that allocation for us, but we still have the ability to override that if we so wish. But I'll just leave it as the default values and then click on Submit Receipt. When I have that done, you'll see I have the option of printing a receipt to post out to the tenant or hand it to them if they've paid it in person, or I can email the receipt directly to the tenant. Just a few more examples of this. If the monies had been paid by the County Council or Benefit Authority, the process is exactly the same. I record the amount that was received from the council, but this time change it from tenant payment to benefit payment. Again, Affinity will do a lookup of the tenancy details previously supplied and see what elements of the recurring charge breakdown are due from the council or benefit authority and allocate them to the various charge types for us. But again, when we're finished, we just click on Submit Receipt and that'll be allocated to that tenant's rent account. You'll see that there is a third option if you do require security deposits from your tenant. When you receive payment in relation to that, again, just enter the amount that you've received, but this time specify that it was a security deposit that you had received. The other tabs that we've got are a payments tab. If you're making a payment back out to the tenant, that could be a refund of rent, either directly to the tenant or if it was an overpayment in relation to some form of housing benefit payment, we can select benefit refund. And finally, if you're giving back a security deposit, select return of security deposit. The third tab is credits debits, and this allows us to perform a manual adjustment to the tenant balance. Now, it could be in relation to rent or service charge, and it can be either the tenant balance of that recurring charge or the benefit element of that recurring charge. So if we wanted to say apply a goodwill gesture to that tenant because they'd done some DIY on the house, saving the housing association the trouble of doing that, I can put a €50 tenant credit against the rent and just put goodwill there and submit that. The other common example of the use of credits debits is to write off bad debt, and you can see that we have an option there to tick a checkbox if that's what the credit's going to be applied in relation to that. So we've seen how rents are applied, how rents are received back from the tenant. We now want to produce a statement in relation to that tenant. So I'll go back to our tenant view. I'm going to just search on the account number using our quick search facility. Here is our tenant, and you'll see we didn't look at it previously. The third tab along here is the statement tab. So if we click on that, it'll give us the tenant statement. Please forgive the test figures here. It is just a demo account. Hopefully none of your tenants are this far in arrears with their rent. But you'll see a few entries here. you'll see that we're generating the statement over this particular month, but I can do it over, say, all of this year. So you'll see all of the rents that have been applied on a weekly basis this year. But here are the three entries that I'm just after recording. Here's the €100 that has been received from the tenant, the €325 from the benefit authority, and the €50 rental credit that we've just applied. Now, obviously, we can generate a paper version of this by clicking on the print icon. Again, you'll see it'll have your housing association logo up at the top of the screen, and we can print this out and post it to the tenant. If we want to save on the postage costs, we can instead email this out to the tenant and just fire that off. Obviously, you could potentially have hundreds of tenants, and it might be quite time consuming to do this on an individual basis. So it's good practice to send out statements to your tenants on at least a quarterly basis. So you'll see that we do have an option here to send out statements in batch. So if I click on the batch statements menu item, you'll see it presents us with a list of our housing groups. I can select individual housing groups, or if I want to send statements to all tenants, I can click on the select all button. Down at the bottom, we've got our statement options. These include the ability to specify the date range over which the statement should span, and also the format, how we want to dispatch these statements, either in printable format if we're using post, or we can email them out to the tenants. One last thing to highlight in relation to tenant receipts and statements is if you are a large housing association, you may perhaps think that the receiving of individual tenant payments may be time consuming. So to overcome this, we do have a bulk import facility. So you'll see under the bank area import payments, and we accept two formats. One is a CSV stroke Excel format, and the other is the bill pay format used by An Post. So if you have clients in household budget and that's how they make their rent payments, you may wish to make use of this mechanism as well. You can contact us if you require further detail on this. I now want to look at the repair property maintenance side of Affinity, and that's covered by the suppliers and work orders menu items down the left hand side. So suppliers would be your subcontractors, people like electricians, plumbers, joiners, handymen, any third parties that assist with your property maintenance. To add details of a new supplier into the system, we click on suppliers and then click on add supplier. So you'll see most of the fields are optional here. We really just give a supplier name, their address. We can optionally specify which trade the supplier is associated with. You can define additional trades in the admin area of Affinity, or even by just clicking on new trade in the list there. You'll see by default there'll be options selected to email work orders to the supplier if you've provided an email address. So if you assign a work order to this supplier, they will automatically receive an email notification with the job sheet attached to it. There's also the option to send a text message to the supplier upon assignment of a work order as well. A couple of things just to point out over on the right hand side sometimes catches people out. By default, we have this insurance required checkbox ticked. That means that unless you have provided details of current insurance policies for this supplier, you will not be able to assign a work order to that supplier. You can optionally also check the trade membership option, and again that would mean, if checked, that unless you have valid trade membership details defined alongside the supplier, you'll not be able to assign a work order to them. So when we have that information supplied, we just click on add supplier to add them into the system. Again, to look at an existing supplier, we can click on suppliers, list suppliers. In this instance, I'll just select one of the suppliers that have already been entered into the system, AM Rentals. So just click on their name. As before, you'll see that we've got a series of tabs across the top here, being insurance details that I've just mentioned, membership details, tax clearance certificates, correspondence documents. For these three, insurance, membership, tax clearance certificates, again we've got alert reports to tell you when these are about to expire. So with our suppliers defined, we're now in a position to raise work orders. We can do that via work orders, add work order. A work order can either be raised against an individual property or the housing group or housing scheme as a whole. In this instance, I'm going to raise one against a property. So to select the property address from the drop-down list, or to make it simpler, start typing part of the address and then select it from the narrowed down list. You'll see that when the property has been selected, some additional information is available to us, including the work order history, a pop-up window. We can look at previous work orders that have been raised against this particular property to see if there's any patterns arising. We've got the care alert. It may be useful to anyone dealing with this particular maintenance request. Who the tenants are that are currently residing within the property, current rent or tenant balance, and some contact details associated with the tenant. We can specify who the staff member is responsible for this work order, and then we have to provide a category. These will align to the happen report categories of response, voids, planned and cyclical, plus one other for new acquisitions, which won't be included in any happen reports that we generate from the system. So if it is a response, then we also have to give it a priority: routine, urgent or emergency. I'll leave it at routine. We have a submission date, optionally put in a purchase order number and an estimated cost. So we must give it a description, what's wrong with the property that we need to raise a work order. So I'll just say that the boiler's broken and add that work order into the system. So you'll see that the work order has now been raised. It's the initial state associated with it. We can add multiple notes against this work order as we go along, just to provide additional detail. But the next simple step is to assign this work order to one of our suppliers. So I'm going to select again rentals from the drop down list. When we do that, you'll see that additional information is provided in relation to this particular supplier. We have two options. If it's a high value work order, which this one potentially could be, we can request quotes from several suppliers and then award it to the most appropriate quote that we receive back. I'm going to keep it simple and just assign it to AM Rentals without going through the quote process. We've got an option here to notify the supplier via text message. I'll turn that off. We also have an option to notify the tenant that we are processing the work order, who the supplier is that's going to be working on this particular activity, and how soon the tenant should expect a response from that particular supplier. Again, I'm going to turn that off. So I'm going to click on assign work order and it moves to its next state, which is an assigned state. The final state really is when the supplier comes in and says that work's done, here's my invoice. We have to record the actual cost associated with that bit of work and then just mark the work order or the activity as complete. So we have marked it as complete, doesn't mean we've paid the supplier as yet. As the supplier payment is a financial transaction, it must be completed via the bank area. So we select bank from the main menu bar and then supplier transactions. Select our supplier AM Rentals from the drop down list and we'll be presented with a list of work orders that have been completed by the supplier but for which we have yet to make full payment. So we can see the recently completed work order done at the bottom of the list here, along with a few other ones. If we just want to settle up in full with this supplier, we click on the Pay in Full button, enter the transaction details, including the bank account from which we're going to make the payment, the transaction date, which we can change if we wish, optionally put in a check number, invoice number and description, and then just submit that. And then what you'll see that there no longer remains any work orders to be paid to this particular supplier. So after recording the supplier transaction, we may wish to generate a statement for that supplier. So we can do that via the reports area. So report supplier, Select our supplier from the drop-down list. There is only one supplier report type, that's the supplier statement, and we just specify the date range over which we want to generate the statement. I'll just do it over the last year. So what will be shown is a list of work orders completed by the supplier over the specified date range, along with any payments made, and you'll see that we have a zero balance at the bottom of the screen. So we have the options of either printing or emailing this statement. To complete this section, we'll just briefly look at the suite of reports that are available within Affinity to assist you in the maintenance activities associated with your housing association. These can be selected via reports, work orders. So you'll see that we can generate reports to detail work orders that are past their target response times. We can generate reports that'll group work orders by housing group, by property. We can look at work orders that are still awaiting quotes coming in, work orders grouped by supplier, or group them by the various states. And now I want to move on to look at some of the other reports that are available within Affinity. These generally are available from within the reports area. We've already covered tenant statements and batch tenant statements. Recently we looked at supplier statements, and we've just covered the reports in the work orders area. There are also financial reports available via Reports Bank. In addition to summarising financial information associated with your Affinity account, they're also used if you enter financial transactions in error. For instance, if you record a tenant receipt incorrectly, we go to Reports Bank Tenant Transaction Report. It's the one that's selected by default because it's probably the one that you'll use most often. We click on Next, specify a date range in which the transaction was entered, and then we can see transactions entered over that specified date range. We select the transaction that we wish to delete. We have to put in a reason for deletion to satisfy the audit trail within Affinity. And then we click on the delete button, and that will delete it from the tenant's account and from all financial logs. Similarly, we can delete rental credits or debits entered in error via the rental credit debit report, and also the same function is available via the supplier transaction report. You'll see that other financial reports are available, such as the bank account statement. This will detail all financial transactions that impact the specified bank account. Moving on from bank, we can look at some of our alert reports. Earlier in the presentation, I looked at quite a few of these, such as safety check alerts, block services check alerts, inspection alerts for both property and housing groups. But just to point out a few other ones that are available, we've got an account list, and that's effectively tenant balances that are in arrears. So you'll see that it lists all tenants that are currently in arrears. It gives the number of weeks in arrears along with what their current rent value is. Just also point out that by clicking on the tenant balance itself, we get an expanded view to see all correspondence with the associated tenant in relation to their arrears balance. We can also generate a tenant statement over a specified date range, and what's also visible are any recent payments made by that tenant to see if they're making some effort to clear their arrears balance. If we compress this view again, just one other feature to point out, you'll see that the tenants that we have stored mobile phone numbers against have the mobile icon alongside their details. So it's possible from this view to send them a reminder about their arrears balance, or if this is, say, a weekly or monthly task performed within your housing association, it is possible to do a select all and send out a message to all of the selected tenants. Moving on to management reports, these obviously allow us to analyse the performance of our housing association, so I'd like to touch on some of these. The summary report provides analysis at a housing group level. It will look at rents received against rents due, and will also provide arrears ratios over a specified date range. You'll see that there's a number of other reports to perform arrears analysis, void analysis, and analysis even of how our housing officers are performing in relation to each other. One that's of interest to many people is the ability to generate happen reports. So it's one of our management reports. So if we select it, we can generate a new happen report by clicking on the button. It will default to the last completed quarter, and then we click on the generate draft. What you'll see here is that it says that it's in a pending state. It just takes a few seconds for this report to be generated, but if we refresh our browser, you'll see that it's available now. This is in draft format, so you'll see that we can review the information inserted by Affinity and make modifications where required. So obviously it's got contact details, details of our housing stock, average rents for the various different funding scheme types. So if you need to make any modifications to this, you can manually do this. And then when finished, you can create the report, and you'll see that it's now available in PDF format. So again, if I click on the magnifying glass this time, we can print out a paper or PDF version of this. So we'll just close that down again. Last set of reports to look at are our logs. And as I've mentioned before, there's a full audit trail within Affinity. It records who does what within the system in terms of additions, amendments, and deletions. So if we want to look, for instance, at who has been recording or deleting tenant transactions, we can select that, specify a date range, and then run the report. So you'll see that it's got the name of the user that has performed a couple of additions, and here's the deletion that we completed just a few minutes ago. It gives a date and time stamp for each activity. The last area that I want to look at is the admin area. As the name suggests, this allows us to perform various administration tasks in relation to our Affinity account. The main activity within the control panel is the setting up of user accounts. We recommend that you create a user account for each and every person that is accessing your Affinity account. There's no additional cost for that. You can do that by simply clicking on the Add User Account button, specifying the access level, give a name, username, and an email address. That user will then receive an email notification with details how they can access Affinity. The other important option within the admin area is the export facility. We provide a comprehensive suite of reports within Affinity, but there's always additional analysis of data that can be performed. So we do provide this export ability. You can export information in CSV or Excel format, financial information, lists of properties, tenants, etc. So for instance, if I wanted to get a list of all of my tenants, I can just select tenants, click on export, and then I shall open up this export. So you'll see we have a spreadsheet with details of all of our tenants. Finally, just to point out that Affinity comes with a comprehensive user guide. So if you're struggling to find how to do something, you can first refer to the user guide. Here's a list of common tasks. So if I wanted to know how to record the receipt of a rent payment, I can go here and you'll see it gives me a step-by-step guide as to how to achieve that. If you can't find what you're looking for there, then what you can do is you can raise a support request with the Affinity team, part of your monthly subscription, and that can be done by emailing support@tiltaffinity.com. That basically concludes our overview of the application. If you have any further questions, then feel free to get in touch. Our contact details are available from our website.